Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to learn about Aninut, the halachic time period between, sadly, the death of one's family member and the burial of that family member. This time period seems to be distinct from what we usually think about as shiva, as the beginning of mourning or avilut, and I want to understand what the character is. We find this taken up in this week's daf on Zevachim Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph and Kuf Aleph Amud Bet in a discussion about the famous Aninut in the Torah, which is the Aninut that Aaron and his sons Elazar and Itamar experienced after his other two sons, Nadav and Avihu, were killed for bringing a foreign fire in the Mishkan at its inauguration. So let's pick up on Vayikra Perek Yud, Pasuk Vav, where Moshe starts to share with Aaron what he is expected to do in the aftermath of this death, because after all, you would imagine that he should just get involved in the burial and the mourning practices. But then you pause and hold back and say, well, actually, they're not going to get involved in the burial because they're Kohanim, and Aaron is really not going to get involved in becoming tameh even for these people because he's a Kohen Gadol. But what about the mourning practices? So it's a little bit dicey because you have a number of different vectors in the response after this death. Vayomer Moshe el Aaron ve'Elazar Itamar banav. So Moshe says to Aaron and his two remaining sons, Rashechem al tifrau, do not grow your hair long, parentheses. This is how we know you're supposed to grow your hair long when you're in mourning, because he has to tell them not to. Uvigdechem lo tifromu, and don't rend your garments, don't tear your clothes, don't tear kriya, again, parentheses. This is where we see you should be tearing kriya usually. Velo tamutu val kolei dayiktzov, so that you won't die and God won't be angry at the whole community. In other words, this is a Yotzei Min HaKlal. This is an exceptional moment telling you not to do the usual mourning practices, right? V'achechem kol beit Yisrael yifku et hasrifa asher saraf Hashem. But your brethren, the Jewish people, they will cry about the burning that God has done. Meaning it sounds like you're going to keep going with your avodah, with your worship in the Mishkan, and everybody else is going to mourn in some way. Umipetach ol moed lo tetzu, do not leave the entrance of the tent of meeting, meaning stay where you are in the Mishkan precincts, pen tamutu, lest you die. Ki shemen mishchat Hashem alechem, because you have been anointed with God's oil. Vayasu kidvar Moshe. And so they followed what Moshe said, meaning it seems like because they were anointed Kohanim and Kohen Gadol, respectively, they had to stick with it and not leave. And yet, things get a little more complicated as you continue in the parak. So skipping a few pesukim, V'yidaber Moshe el Aharon ve'el Elazar ve'el Itamar banav hanotarim. Moshe speaks to them again and says, K'chu et hamincha hanoteret me'ishei Hashem. I want you to take the korban mincha, the flour offering, v'ichlu hamatzot etzal mizbeach, and I want you to eat it near the mizbeach, ki kodesh kadashini, because it is the most holy. Ve'acheltem otam be'otam b'makom kadosh, you're going to eat it in a holy place. Ki chokcha v'chok banecha hi me'ishei Hashem, ki chen tzuveti. Right? That is what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to eat the remnant of the korban mincha, and this is what I have been commanded. Moreover, and you're also going to take some of the parts of the shlamim offering that had been given. You're also going to eat those in a pure place, your whole families, right? Because as we've discussed in previous shirim, a korban shlamim is eaten by the whole Kohen family. Because again, this is really what's due to you. So you're supposed to eat it, and then he goes on and has one more pasuk explaining. But in pasuk Ted Zion, it gets really interesting because it seems like he tells them to eat the mincha, flour offering, eat with their families the shlamim. But when it comes to the hatat, Moshe realizes they didn't eat it. Ve'et se'ir hachatat, meaning, and the chatat is eaten only by male kohanim and only in the precincts of the temple. Ve'et se'ir hachatat, darosh darash Moshe v'hinei soraf. Moshe asks about what happened to the chatat, the korban chatat. They were supposed to eat that leftovers in temple precincts, but it turns out they burnt it instead. Vayiktsov al Elazar v'al Tamar b'nei Aharon hanutarim lemor, and they got mad, and he gets mad at Elazar and Itamar. Madua lo achaltem et hachatat b'makom hakodesh? Why didn't you eat the chatat? Ki kodesh kodeshim hi, it's the holiest. V'otan natan lachem lasedet avon ha'ideh lechaper alehem lifnei Hashem, and that is actually part of the expiation that you make for the people before God, is eating that, right? It's not like it was the type of offering where the blood was offered inside the Kodesh or on the parochet of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, where we learned, I think we mentioned in last week's shir, that they don't actually eat that. They are supposed to burn it, right? He says, "Achol tochluota bakodesh kasher tziveti." You should have eaten this. You notice how he keeps saying, "As I was commanded," you should be eating it. Vaydaber Aharon al Moshe, but Aharon turns to Moshe and says, Hein hayom hikrivu et chatatam ve'et olotam lifnei Hashem, vatikureno oti ka'ele, v'achalti chatat hayom, hayitav b'nei Hashem. He says, look, we brought all the stuff we were supposed to bring, but look at the terrible things that happened. Do you think Hashem would be happy do you think God would have thought of it as a positive if we had eaten the chatat? Meaning, we're owning him. We should not be eating the korban chatat. Vayishma Moshe vayitav beinav. And this Moshe accepted. Now, this is quite interesting because this is Aaron making a claim, essentially saying, even if you're going to have us keep doing the avoda, even if you're going to have us not show signs of avilut, it would be inappropriate for us to eat the korban chatat. And that's where our Gemara in Zevachim picks up. And it's really quite interesting because you have a braita that's brought suggesting that Moshe was actually very confident, saying to them, you should be eating this stuff. He kept saying, Kichein tzuveti, kasher tzivah Hashem. God told me, right? You're supposed to eat it even when you're onain. And then the Gemara brings a different braita that says, Aaron turned to Moshe and said, it's because of the Aninut that we burnt it, and Moshe accepts it. But the way that the Gemara ends up is that eating kachim when you're an onain is a problem. And the Gemara actually discusses how we know that it's a problem to eat kachim when you're an onain. Now, I should say parenthetically, you're not allowed to eat any meat or any wine, drink any wine when you're an onain, but the eating of kachim when you're an onain is an iser min haTorah coming from here, but it's more than that. The Gemara says it's actually a kal v'chomer from another place in the Torah where we say, I specifically didn't eat something because I was an onain, and that is in the situation of biur ma'asrot. Every year we give Maaser Rishon to the Levi. Some of the years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, we eat Maaser Sheni in Yerushalayim. And some of the years in the Shemitah cycle, instead of eating Maaser Sheni in Yerushalayim ourselves, we do Maaser Ani, which we give to others. It's not for us to eat ourselves. And as it happens, the Torah talks about in Perek Kavav of Devarim that every 3 years, you have to make sure that you got rid of all your masrot from the years before. Goes like this: Ki techalel aseret kol maaser tuatcha b'shana shlishit shnat maaser. When you finish setting aside maaser in the 3rd year, because we usually think about this on 3-year cycles. Years 1 and 2, you do Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni. That's where you go to Yerushalayim and eat it. That's Maaser Sheni. And year 3, you do Maaser Rishon and Maaser Ani. Same thing. Years 4 and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, you do Maaser Rishon, which you give to a Levi, and Maaser Sheni, which you eat yourself in Yerushalayim. And year 6, you do Maaser Rishon to the Levi and Maaser Ani. So at the end of each of these third years, which actually Chazal learned what we're talking about is actually in the fourth year, it's because you should have taken Masrot from the three previous years, right? You should make sure that any of the Maser that you haven't given yet, you take care of and make sure it's given. Meaning if you have Maser Ani that hasn't been taken, you have to give that Maser Ani, right? We actually today I put a little I put a little link in here if people want to see practically how things go, because today we take our Maaser Sheni and what's the word? Like we're mechalel it. We make it mundane based on a coin. And by that fourth year, you actually have to get rid of that coin, make it unusable. So there's actually practical things that happen here. This is called Bi'ur Masrot. It happens Erev Pesach of the fourth year, every fourth year. And in fact, this year, Erev Pesach, is a Biur Masrot year. But what's interesting is that for Biur Masrot, you actually have something called Vidui Maser or Vidui Masrot, where you are making a declaration about the fact that you gave all of your Maser that you were supposed to give. And by the way, this extends to other things. It extends to Hafrashat Chala, extends to other things. But the point is what you're supposed to say, and you don't actually do the vidui at the same time as you do the biur. You do the vidui at the end of Pesach. But for those who do vidui these days, because that's a machloket, v'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, you should say before God, bi'arti hakodesh min habayit. I've cleared out all the consecrated portions from my home. V'gam netativ lalev v'lagir v'layatom v'lalmana kechol mitzvotcha asher tzivitani. I gave it to all the people I was supposed to give it to. Lo avarti mitzvotecha v'lo I didn't um, transgress your law, and I didn't forget. And here's our punchline. Lo achalti ve'oni mimenu. I didn't eat it when I was in Oni with an aleph. I didn't eat it when I was in Onin. So the Gemara says, well, if you're not allowed to eat Maser, let's think Maser Sheni, which is the one I'm supposed to eat. If I'm not allowed to eat that when I'm in Onin, certainly I shouldn't be eating my korban hatat, achilat kachim would be a problem when somebody is an oni, right? So this concept of not eating certain things, specifically kachim, specifically maaser, and by the way, this also extends to bikurim because bikurim has simcha involved. Min haTorah, we learn about aninut here from that. But the truth is that there is more to aninut than just that. These are things that would be reflected in the world of Kudshim and Mikdash. And like we said way back when we were starting Kudshim, one of the things that's really interesting about learning Kudshim is that you see how this stuff actually relates to our daily lives even today. So I want to go to the place where the Gemara talks about Aninut, but isn't talking about Aninut in terms of the Mikdash. It's talking about Aninut as in our everyday mundane lives. And that is the third chapter of Masechet Brachot. The opening Mishnah, the third parak of Masechet Brachot, is about an onin or an onenet. Misha meto mutal lefanav, if someone's deceased relative is laid out unburied before them, pater mikriyat shma, umina tefila, umina tefillin, umikol mitzvot hamurot b'Torah. That person is exempt from saying Shema, from saying Shemona Esrei, from wearing tefillin, from all positive mitzvot of the Torah. And then the Mishnah talks about, might this also apply to people who are pallbearers, meaning anybody who's somehow involved in the burial process. Now, this is really expanding because I would have thought, okay, I'm not allowed to eat maser or bikurim or kachim when I'm an onin or when I'm an onenet, God forbid. But to say, oh, I don't do any positive mitzvot, meaning I don't bench, I don't say brachot, I don't, right? Like, what is this, right? So the Yerushalmi talks about the question of what exactly is this about? I actually, before looking, no, let's look at the Yerushalmi first. Amar Rabbi Bon. Rabbi Bon says, K'tiv, it says, L'mat tizkor yom tzeitzcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha, right? In discussing, uh, um, remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, it says, in Devarim, Perek Tet Zayin, learn so that you remember the day of leaving Egypt all the days of your life. And so the Gemara says, Yamim she'at osek behen v'chayim, meaning only the days where you are involved with life. V'lo yamim she'at osek behen b'meitim, and not days when you are involved with the dead, right? Meaning, that's a pasuk that tells you about Pesach, but any of the mitzvot that are involved in the remembrance of Yetziat Mitzrayim seem to be included, and that includes tefillin, for example. So the mischak milim, or the planned words here, is you should remember Yetziat Mitzrayim all the days of your life, meaning on the days that you are involved with living people. That's when a person wears tefillin. But on days when they're involved with dead people, then they are not, right? Now, maybe that makes it sound like the reason for aninut, the reason for being patur, ptura from positive commandments is because you're busy with the burial, right? So the Gemara continues, Tani im ratza lahachmir al atzmo ein shom'in lo, right? It was stated if a person decides, well, I actually want to be stringent. I want to do positive commandments during this time after the death, but before the burial. One opinion says you don't listen to them. Lama, why? Mipnei kvodo shel met, because the reason why they are supposed to be in this status of aninut is because they're supposed to, uh, um, maybe it's because they are supposed to be honoring the dead. O mishum she'en lo mi she'yisa masa'o. Or maybe it's because actually they need somebody to carry the load, meaning prepare for the burial. Ma nafik beinehon, what would be the difference between them? Hayalo mi she'yisa masa'o, right? If they had somebody who actually could take care of the burial for them. V'in temar mipnei kvodo shel met asur. If you say, but the reason you're doing this is actually to show kavod to the dead, then we would say, no, it's still prohibited for you to do positive mitzvot. V'im tamar mipnei she'en lo mi she'yisa masa'o. But if you say it's actually more of a utilitarian concern, that it's because we need somebody who's going to prepare the burial, they have somebody who's going to prepare the burial for them, and so it's unnecessary. If they decide that they want to do mitzvot, they can choose to do mitzvot. So already what you see here is the Yerushalmi is presenting maybe this situation of aninut is either a situation where you're thinking about this in a, well, I need to show the gravity of what's happened, right? This person has died and they haven't yet been buried. They haven't yet come to their eternal resting place. I'm not going to go about my life in the regular way when they haven't even had a chance to be buried. Another way of looking at it is actually, we basically say, Osik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah. You're busy with a mitzvah of making sure that they get buried, and that's why you don't have to do other mitzvot. But if you have somebody else who's taking care of it, you'll be totally fine. You can do the mitzvot, right? So how do we think about aninut, right? Now, there are lots of ways, there are lots more, um, you know, there's lots more to talk about here, but I actually want to end with something my brother-in-law wrote, Rabbi Shmuel Hain, that I thought was really useful, really helpful, and I'm going to include a link to the article here. He wrote it in the Festschrift for Rabbi J.J. Schachter. It's about the history of the, Halakhah kedivrei hamekil ba'avelut, that the law follows the lenient view in mourning. And within that article, he makes a distinction between aninut and avelut, okay? It says, we identify in rabbinic texts a broader, excuse me, 1 second, let's go down to it. We identify in rabbinic texts a broader distinction between the laws governing immediate responses to death and those following burial when shiva begins, right? Meaning, aninut is separate and avelut is separate, or shiva is separate. Perhaps the most significant, albeit subtle evidence of this essential distinction is the separate placement within the Talmudic corpus, meaning within all of Shas, of the laws governing one who has a deceased relative before them, and the mourning laws beginning with Shiva. The former, also known as the laws of Aninut, are primarily addressed in the third chapter of Brachot, while the latter are detailed in the third chapter of Moed Katan. Meaning, if you wanted to find the laws of Aninut, you would look in the third chapter of Brachot. If you wanted to find the laws of Shiva and more, right, you would look in the third chapter of Moed Katan. They're brought in separate places. This decoupling of the sugyot of Aninut and Avelut reflect a fundamental distinction between the two stages of bereavement. The actions taken between the time of death and interment constitute symbolic expressions of the instinctual, emotional responses to death, or news of death. The laws of Avelut, by contrast, constitute the formal ceremonial laws of mourning commencing with Shiva. The Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Perek Vav, Mishnah Vav, 6:6, also projects the view that the two stages are conceptually distinct when it prohibits Avelut for relatives of those who receive capital punishment, but acknowledges that Aninut happens. The relatives of the executed person would not mourn them, right? They are not mitablin, but they would grieve, oninin, because grief takes place in the heart. And I put it right above, she'in aninut ella balev. In addition to constituting natural, immediate responses to death, the laws of Aninut are conceptually distinct from the formal laws of Avelut by dint of another essential question. Which individual is the primary concern of these laws? Aninut focuses exclusively on honoring the dead and their needs. Now, I want to point this out. Honoring the dead and their needs, we saw this in the Yerushalmi. It might be honoring the dead, as in, it would be wrong to go about your regular life while this person is not buried. Focusing on their needs might be actually you have a responsibility to get them buried. And if somebody else is on top of that, maybe there are things that you're allowed to do that pull back your aninut. But suffice to say, it's for the dead. The onin is exempt from all positive commandments in order to ensure that burial takes place in a timely and dignified fashion. The normative halachic view, based on the Yerushalmi, forbids grieving relatives from opting to observe these commandments so as to ensure the honor of the deceased, right? This requirement to refrain from observing commandments highlights the non-negotiable value of respecting the dead, a responsibility primarily borne by the deceased close relatives, but also shared by the community at large, right? The Gemara expands the exemption from certain commandments prior to the interment to community members who might be involved in the burial preparations. We said maybe pallbearers, including those who guard the deceased. Similarly, Moed Katan, Kav Zayin Amud Bet 27b, forbids all the inhabitants of a city or a village from the community from engaging in work until the deceased has been buried, etc., etc. Fine. But the point is, the difference between Aninut and Avilut is that Aninut focuses on the dead, and Avilut focuses on the mourner coming back to the community, into the world. Now, the way that I think about this is actually, in a certain sense, this cutting people off from, positive commandments and cutting them off from basar and yayin, cutting them off from achilat kachim. In some sense, I actually think what it's doing is it's allowing the mourner to relate more to the dead than to the living. Whereas Avilut starts a process of actually bringing the mourner back to the living, right? The identification with life and living. And I think in some ways that is reflected here. Thanks for learning with me, everybody. Looking forward to next week.